Hello and welcome back. My name is Erin Merrihew. I'm an empowerment and connection coach. And today I want to talk about the 3 most common boundary setting mistakes that I encounter in my practice and what you can do instead. So when it comes to boundary setting, there are so many different ways that we can set a boundary. And there are some things that are really universally unsuccessful when it comes to boundary setting, but are actually extremely common pitfalls that I really want to focus on. So that's the focus of today's video. So let's jump right into it. The first common boundary setting mistake I see is that people tend to focus on communicating the behavior they want the other person to stop doing or start doing, instead of really focusing on why that behavior is important to them in the first place. So this is very understandable. We all do this, right? We tend to notice our boundaries the most when it comes to experiencing a behavior that we don't like or lacking a behavior that we would really like to see. And so that's very natural that we find our way to the boundary we need first by looking at behavior. That's a great entry point. But if we keep the conversation only on the level of that behavior, we're likely to risk that the other person starts to also fixate on that behavior and start, trying to justify why they do that behavior, or sort of like we both nitpick that behavior and really miss the deeper point of this interaction, which is for that person to get to know me better, to get to know how I operate, what my needs are, what's important to me in relationship, and really what's going to work for me, how they can show up for me in this relationship. So in most cases, when we just focus on that behavior, like let's say it's unsolicited advice, and I want someone to stop giving me unsolicited advice. If I just come into the interaction and I say, hey, I wanted to talk to you about something. I noticed that you often give me unsolicited advice or advice that I just haven't asked you for, and that really doesn't feel good to me. So I just wanted to ask you to please stop doing that. Okay, in some interactions, that might be sufficient and the other person might take that well. In a lot of interactions, the other person might feel like, gosh, I didn't even get a chance to understand what about the unsolicited advice is so offensive to this person. I didn't really feel any vulnerability from Erin when she was saying this. It just feels like a criticism, right? So that's the main risk of just focusing only on the behavior, is that it tends to feel critical. And most of us don't respond very well to a critical statement about something that we've done or something that we chronically do. And so it really helps to bolster the sharing of that behavior with the why underneath. Why is that behavior painful for me? Why is it something that matters to me that you do differently? What's underneath that behavior that is pointing to needs that I have, or feelings that I have, or a certain way that I operate that would really benefit you to know about so that you can take better care of me in this relationship, right? So instead of sharing just the basic statement of, I'd really like you to stop giving me unsolicited advice, you might add something like, hey, I noticed that the last few times that we've interacted about this thing, you've given me advice that I didn't ask for. And, I know that's probably coming from a good place inside you, but for me on the receiving end, I actually start to kind of shut down when I'm offered unsolicited advice. It's something you might not have noticed about me, but I wanted to let you know that that's kind of a difficult thing for me, especially when I'm opening up about something that I care about. What really helps me is for someone to ask questions before they give advice. So in this example, I'm painting a picture of where I go inside when this undesirable behavior happens. I'm not just saying, I don't like that behavior, stop doing it. I'm saying, hey, this behavior is challenging for me and here's why. And I even added something there that really helps in a lot of boundary conversations, which is, I imagine that came from a good place inside of you, right? Many of the boundary violations we experience are people acting on positive intentions. And if we can convey that and convey why that behavior didn't work for us, where it took us inside in a vulnerable way that gives them insight into what matters to us, and maybe even gives them an alternative behavior that they could do instead, that's going to be a lot better conversation, and the other person has a much higher chance of not repeating the boundary violation because they have emotional investment. they don't feel criticized, they actually feel redirected. Like, oh, there's something that I could do instead, a better way to engage with this person. And most of us really like to know how we can engage effectively with the people in our lives. Okay, so that's the first common boundary mistake. The second common boundary mistake, and I am guilty of this one just as much as the next person, is that we enter the boundary setting conversation with a defensive stance. We come in feeling like we need to defend ourselves, like the other person is against us, and just kind of afraid, right? We're bracing, we're guarded. When we come into an interaction with that energy, I don't care what conversation it is, we're focusing on boundaries here, but it could be any conversation. Energy is contagious. Human beings are really, really sensitive to energy. Whether we realize it or not, we're responding to the other person's energetic state. So if I come into a boundary setting interaction and I'm really guarded and I'm bracing and I'm defensive and I'm like, look, this thing doesn't feel good to me, or I don't want this to happen again. Very rarely is the other person going to feel open and curious, which are the feelings we want them to feel for a boundary conversation. Because if they are defensive and on guard, they're not going to be able to take in very much information, and they're certainly not going to be able to bring their vulnerability to the table, which is usually necessary for an effective boundary setting conversation. So how do we shift this? Because this is a really tricky one. None of us want to feel defensive. It doesn't feel good. It's not usually an energetic state that we're trying to bring. It's sort of involuntary. So here's the shortcut that I really like for this one. I like to visualize this person that I'm about to go have the boundary setting conversation with in their most resourced, calm state. And I like to come to the conversation imagining that they are going to come to the conversation with that energy. Of course, that's not always the case, right? But imagining that they are going to access their most resourced, most caring, most receptive energy, imagining that puts me in a more trusting position. And when I come to the table in a more trusting position, the other person feeds off of that energy. They go, okay, I can tell something's up with Erin, but I can also tell that she's on my team. And we can pick up really quickly when the other person is not on our team. So if this visualization is challenging for you, maybe you've never seen this person in a really calm, resourced state, or maybe you've had some really negative interactions and that's why you're setting the boundary. I like to imagine a visualization where I sprinkle magic fairy dust on this person and I literally watch their entire physiology relax, right? So you're imagining them in an altered state almost, right? You sprinkle this magic fairy dust and you see them relaxing and you see them entering this kind of higher self that we all have inside. You might have never seen that. You might have never seen them in this state, but you're going to imagine this. And relating to that image, relating to that energy is going to put you in a more relaxed state so that if they are defensive or if they are unreceptive toward what you're saying, you're in a calmer place coming in and you have more resources to respond to that than coming in really bracing and guarded. Okay, so that's the second boundary setting mistake. Our third and final boundary setting mistake is either sharing too little about our boundary or sharing too much about our boundary. I find that this question of how much transparency to give about our boundaries is a really tricky one, and I'm constantly coaching people how to find their transparency sweet spot with boundaries. So I think that it's really easy to either assume that someone can sort of mind read us and they already know why we want a boundary or what happens for us around this boundary, or to kind of go in the opposite direction and feel like we have to like completely unload our entire emotional baggage about this boundary on this person in order for them to understand us. And both of these are kind of off-putting to the person who's receiving our boundary. If we share too little, it sort of goes back to the first mistake of only focusing on the behavior, right? It's like we're not giving the other person enough information to engage meaningfully with us about this boundary. They might feel criticized or controlled. If we're not giving them enough context, they don't understand the full picture of where this boundary lives in our emotional world, in the relationship. And so they can sort of feel like they have to now tiptoe to do things right. And no one wants to feel that way in a relationship. So sharing too little, the risk is that the person really doesn't have enough context to be honoring of you. They might be able to do this one boundary right, but they haven't learned about you. They haven't understood what's meaningful about this boundary and how it relates to the relationship. And then if we share too much, let's say we share the amount that we would share with our therapist about this boundary, or in the pages of our journal, or with a dear, dear friend, if we're really going into, oh, this is where this boundary comes from in me, and here's where it takes me, and here's my emotional material with it, it tends to feel very quickly like we're expecting the other person to caretake our experience. And most of us have a pretty averse reaction to that. Like, this is Erin's thing. Why am I responsible for all of these layers of her story around this boundary, right? And it kind of reduces that natural possibility of someone really wanting to help us with our boundary, because they kind of feel like unloaded on, emotionally dumped on, right? So we really want to strike that sweet spot of what is the correct amount of emotional context and information that is appropriate in this relationship that's going to produce the outcome I want. So thinking about what level of transparency feels appropriate and productive for this conversation. And most people, when I ask them to slow down and consider this, they have an intuitive sense of this. It's just that they haven't considered it ahead of time, right? So the behavior to do instead here is to make sure that before you go into that conversation, you check in with yourself and really ask, what level of transparency feels appropriate for this relationship? It's going to be different for a close friend versus a colleague or someone I'm just getting to know, right? Those are different levels of transparency that will feel appropriate. And what level of transparency is going to be productive? I might feel quite comfortable with someone, but sharing 95% transparency about my whole process with this boundary is just not going to be productive for that conversation, right? It's not going to produce the kind of connection and interaction that I really want to have. So I would really encourage you to think about what is that level of transparency that's going to be most productive and most appropriate for this connection. And then try out different ways of expressing it. Practice it ahead of time. I like to write it out sometimes, or practice it in the mirror, or even run it by a trusted person in your life. And find that sweet spot of transparency where you start to feel, oh, I start to contract a little bit because I realize I'm oversharing when I go that direction. Or if you share it and the person that you're bouncing it off of says, I feel like you shared it, but it was a little too brief. Like, I really didn't understand what this was about for you. Then you need a little bit more transparency to make it really land. All right, so just to recap, the 3 most common boundary mistakes are: number 1, focusing on the behavior instead of what the impact of that behavior is and why it matters to me to have this boundary. And the behavior that you really want to do there is to make sure you convey not only the behavior that you'd like to see change, but why that matters to you, and really focusing that it's more important to share why, because your goal is for that person to really understand you, not just for them to behave in a particular fashion. The second boundary setting mistake is coming in defensive or guarded. Remember that energy is contagious and you can really set the tone for your interaction by doing a visualization ahead of time, assuming positive intent, assuming that this person wants to help you with your boundary, and maybe even sprinkling some magic fairy dust in your visualization, imagining them coming into a centered, resourced, receptive state, and really letting yourself engage with that energy of trusting that they have your best intentions or best interest at heart, and coming in with that kind of trusting, vulnerable energy instead of so defensive. And the third one is either sharing too little or too much about your boundary. When you share too little, you don't give the other person enough to work with to actually get to know you and really honor you. And when you share too much, they often feel over responsible and kind of withdraw because it feels like you're not taking any ownership of your own material around the boundary. So finding that sweet spot, asking yourself, what is the most appropriate and productive amount of transparency that I could share about why this boundary matters to me, and practicing it ahead of time so that you can really find that sweet spot before you go into the conversation. I hope that this video was helpful for you. I hope that these tips can encourage you to be brave in your boundary setting conversations, to sidestep some of those common pitfalls when it comes to boundary setting. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to my channel because I really don't want you to miss out on any of the videos that I continue to post here. And if you have a question or there's something that really resonated with you from the video, please drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I hope that you have a wonderful journey with boundary setting and continue to take risks and be vulnerable and authentic in asking for what you need. All right, take care.